Chapter 6. Pluralistic Phenomenalistic Idealism. The System of Hume. Close upon the idealistic system of that genial Irish churchman, Bishop Berkeley, follows an idealism of a very different sort, that of the Scotchman, David Hume, who was skeptic, critic, diplomat, historian, and man of the world, as well as philosopher. Like Leibniz and Berkeley, Hume teaches that reality is through and through immaterial, but he does not conceive of this immaterial universe after their fashion, as a society of related selves. Rather, he believes the universe to consist of a great complex of ever-shifting sensations and images, or, to use his own words, of impressions and ideas. In technical terms, Hume's philosophy, while numerically pluralistic, is qualitatively an idealistic, but a phenomenalistic monism. The many individual beings of his universe are not selves or spirits, but psychic phenomena, impressions, and ideas. It is difficult to overemphasize the historical importance of this new direction in idealism. Up to Hume's time, no modern philosopher had doubted that an immaterial, an ideal, universe must mean a universe composed of spiritual beings, of selves. Hume challenges this belief, denies the existence of spirit no less than that of matter, and conceives the universe as immaterial indeed, but as composed not of selves, but of ideas. This account of Hume's doctrine is, in a way, misleading, in that it lays the emphasis on his positive conception of the universe, whereas Hume's teaching is, above all, negative, and Hume himself was skeptic, not constructive philosopher, was destroyer of traditional beliefs, rather than founder of a new system. The truth is, however, that one cannot tear down without at the same time heaping up, and accordingly Hume, in questioning both materialism and idealism, really formulated a new doctrine. 1. The foundation principles of Hume's metaphysics. The positive doctrine to which Hume's skepticism committed him has two foundation principles. One of these is his teaching about impressions, the other is his causality doctrine. Before proceeding to the consideration of Hume's conclusions, it is therefore necessary to understand and to estimate these two underlying conceptions. A. The derivation of idea from impression. The perceptions of the human mind resolve themselves, Hume says, into two distinct kinds which I shall call impressions and ideas. The difference between these, he continues, consists in the degrees of force and liveliness with which they strike upon the mind and make their way into our thought or consciousness. Those perceptions which enter with most force and violence we may name impressions, and under this name I comprehend all our sensations, passions, and emotions, as they make their first appearance in the soul. By ideas I mean the faint images of these in thinking and reasoning, such as, for instance, are all the perceptions excited by the present discourse, excepting only those which arise from the sight and touch, and excepting the immediate pleasure or uneasiness it may occasion. This introductory statement makes evident that Hume recognizes two groups of sensations: impressions of sensation, as he later names them, of sight, touch, and the rest, and impressions of reflection, pleasure and uneasiness, the affective experiences, as modern psychologists have called them. The quoted paragraph further indicates the three main differences which Hume makes between impressions and ideas. The impressions are 1. Livelier, more forcible, more vivid than ideas, and 2. In occurrence, prior to ideas. From this last named character it follows, Hume teaches 3. That impressions are the necessary cause or source of ideas, and conversely that ideas are the mere effects and copies of impressions. All our simple ideas in their first appearance are derived from simple impressions, which they exactly represent. The constant conjunction of our resembling perceptions is a convincing proof that the one are the cause of the other, and this priority of the impressions is an equal proof that our impressions are the causes of our ideas. It must be noted finally that Hume often supplements his description of impressions as more vivid than ideas by crediting them, with still another character: their correspondence with external objects independent of consciousness. This distinction is suggested in the following passages. The simple impressions, Hume says, always take the precedence of their correspondent ideas. To give a child an idea of scarlet or orange, of sweet or bitter, I present the objects, or in other words, convey to him these impressions. This alleged character of the impressions need not, however, be considered, spite of the fact that it lends a certain plausibility to Hume's teaching. For Hume later denies the very existence of these external objects, and has, therefore, no right to distinguish impression from idea on the ground that the impression corresponds to an object. It is evident that the account just given corresponds roughly to an ordinary psychological distinction between presentations and representations. But we are mainly concerned with the philosophical use which Hume makes of the doctrine thus outlined. It is the following. We know the real, he teaches, only through impressions or ideas. Indeed, since ideas imply preceding impressions, to know is to have impressions. But impressions are either sensations or affections, therefore we know only what we sense or what we feel. Evidently, the validity of this important teaching depends not only on the accuracy of Hume's enumeration of impressions, but on the truth of his teaching that ideas, the faint and later appearing perceptions of the mind, are mere copies of these impressions. Now, Hume may well be right in the belief that our vivid and our primitive experiences consist exclusively of sensations and affections, impressions, but he's clearly wrong in the opinion that we have no experiences excepting sensations and affections and their copies. There is no guide save that of our own introspection in the enumeration of our different kinds of consciousness, and Hume's own introspection elsewhere testifies that he has distinct experiences which are neither sensational nor affective. Thus, he admits our consciousness of causality, identity, and succession, yet these are neither colors nor sounds nor pleasures nor uneasiness. He is accordingly in face of the following dilemma. He has declared that every experience is impression or copy of impression, yet he has admitted the occurrence of experiences not included in his list of impressions. Evidently, he must either increase the number of impressions, or he must admit the existence of ideas which are not mere copies of sensation or affection. b. The doctrine of causality. From the time of Aristotle until Hume wrote his treatise, no philosopher had offered a close analysis of the conception of causality. Descartes and Leibniz, it will be remembered, had without discussion assumed the necessity of certain causal principles. Berkeley had distinguished between causality, the creativeness of spirit, and the regular sequence of idea on idea which, incorrectly as it seemed to him, is called causality. But it was left to Hume, among modern philosophers, first to study carefully the causal relation, and his doctrine forms the most permanently valuable part of his philosophy. Hume is chiefly interested in the relation of cause and effect, because by means of that relation, we are said to go beyond the evidence of our memory and senses. By reasoning that ideas or objects or events must have a suitable cause, all Hume's predecessors argue for God's existence, and all save Leibniz and Berkeley infer the existence of matter independent of mind. And everyday people as well as philosophers reach conclusions about past and future events by assuming that events must have effects and causes. As Hume says, it is constantly supposed that there is a connection between the present fact and that which is inferred from it. This connection, the causal relation, Hume proceeds to analyze in detail. According to the everyday view, there is a power in a moving billiard ball which strikes a second resting ball. This power forces the second ball to move. The motion of the second ball follows necessarily on that of the first. Hume's account of this occurrence is the following. There is no power in the moving ball and no necessity in the movement of the second ball. The movement of the second ball has, however, as a matter of fact, followed repeatedly on that of the first, and our minds, therefore, anticipate the movement of the second ball on seeing the movement of the first, that is, our minds infer that the movement of the second will follow that of the first. In precise terms, according to the everyday view, the causal relation has two important characters. It is, 1, a necessary connection between antecedent cause and following effect, such that, 2, the cause is a power or force. Hume, on the other hand, defines causality as 1, a customary conjunction of events, involving 2, a determination of the mind. By the first of these teachings, he denies the necessity ordinarily attributed to the causal relation, and by the second, he interprets power as a purely mental character. 1. The conception of causality is a customary, not a necessary, connection. Two kinds of necessity are involved in what is called the causal connection of events. The first of these is the necessary or inevitable connection between cause and effect, regarded merely as events in time. It is formulated in the proposition, every present has a past and has a future. This sort of necessary connection is common to succession and to causality. The second sort of necessity is expressed in the proposition, a given event, B, is so connected with a preceding event, A, that no other event could have occurred in the place of B. Hume's main concern is with the strictly causal principle. The effect could not have been other than it is. He denies the truth of this principle, arguing on several grounds that the causal relation is not necessary. The first argument by which Hume seeks to show that the causal relation is not necessary is the fact that, given any causal succession, one may always conceive of it as different, that is, one may imagine the cause to have had a different effect, or the effect to have had a different cause. Only by repeated experience, Hume points out, is it possible to discover what we call the real cause or the real effect. But a necessary relation, he urges, is one whose negation is inconceivable, and which is known to us at once and without repeated experience. For example, it is inconceivable that the relation between 3x2 and 3 plus 3 should be other than that of equality, and so soon as I know the meaning of the terms, unaided by repeated experience, I know this equality. On the other hand, I do not know without trial that a drop of acid will turn a blue fabric red. It is conceivable that the acid should turn the cloth black, or that it should stiffen the fabric instead of eating it. The causal relation, in other words, is not necessary, whereas the mathematical relation is. This teaching is of such importance to the development of Hume's system that it must be considered in detail. It will be well to begin with Hume's own illustrations of the doctrine, just stated and briefly illustrated, that the opposite of any cause or of any effect is conceivable, and that consequently only repeated experience enables us to assign an effect or a cause. Hume's first examples are from unfamiliar cases of causality, for, as he truly says, our inability to know effects or causes, without trial, is most readily admitted with regard to such objects, as we remember to have once been altogether unknown to us. Present two smooth pieces of marble, he continues, to a man who has no tincture of natural philosophy, he will never discover that they will adhere together in such a manner as to require great force to separate them in a direct line, while they make so small a resistance to a lateral pressure. It is equally true, though we seldom realize it, that familiar effects and causes whose opposite now seems impossible to us, had to be learned by repeated experience of them. We are apt to imagine, Hume says a little later, that we could discover, by the mere operation of our reason, without experience the familiar effects of well-known causes. We fancy that were we brought on a sudden into this world, we could at first have inferred that one billiard ball would communicate motion to another upon impulse, and that we needed not to have waited for the event in order to pronounce with certainty concerning it. But this conviction of the necessary, and therefore immediately realized, connection between cause and effect is an illusion. When I see a billiard ball moving in a straight line toward another, even suppose motion in the second ball should by accident be suggested to me, as the result of their contact or impulse, may I not conceive that 100 different events might as well follow from that cause? May not both these balls remain at absolute rest? May not the first ball return in a straight line or leap off from the second in any line or direction? All our reasonings a priori, Hume concludes, will never be able to show us any foundation for this preference. In other words, Hume is sure that the connection between a given event, say, the movement of a billiard ball, and the event which follows it is not a necessary connection, precisely because a different succession of events is conceivable. This argument for the lack of necessity in the causal connection is emphasized by the teaching that only relations whose opposite is inconceivable are necessary. Thus, he would admit that there is a necessary relation, that of unlikeness, between white and black, because one knows the likeness at first sight without any enquiry or reasoning, and because it is inconceivable that white should be like black. His enumeration of necessary relations is the following: relations of resemblance, contrariety, degrees in quality, and proportions in quantity or number. That the square of the hypotenuse, Hume says, is equal to the squares of the two sides is a proposition which expresses a relation between these figures. Propositions of this kind are discoverable by the mere operation of thought, though there never were a circle or triangle in nature, the truths demonstrated by Euclid would forever retain their certainty and evidence. So, to recapitulate, Hume's first argument against the necessity of the causal relation is through the discovery that one cannot, without repeated experience, predict the effect which a given event will have. But a really necessary connection, he teaches, is such that its opposite is inconceivable. It is, therefore, immediately known. The causal relation, accordingly, lacks necessity, since its opposite is conceivable, and since it is known only through accidental and inadequate experience. Causality, in other words, is customary conjunction, not necessary connection. It will be well, before going further, to attempt an estimate of this reiterated argument against the necessity of the causal relation. A careful rereading of the text can hardly fail to convince one that the argument falls short of its purposed result. It shows that we gain, through accidental experience, not our conviction that a cause must be uniformly followed by a similar effect, but merely our knowledge of the precise nature of that effect. The argument has to do, in other words, not with the necessity of the occurrence of a uniform effect, but with the alleged necessity that the effect be of just such or such a nature. Hume sometimes recognizes this limitation of the argument, though he often loses sight of it. In other words, Hume argues, 1. That only through repeated experience may one know, for example, that fire will be the result of friction, and argues, 2. That because such experience is inevitably incomplete, the connection which it discovers cannot be regarded as absolutely necessary. And up to this point Hume is unquestionably correct both in his premises and in his conclusion. We do gain our knowledge of the exact nature of the effects of given causes by repeated experience, and repeated observation, varying with individual and with circumstances, cannot guarantee the universality and the necessity of the causal connection. Hume may be said, then, to have proved that we have only practical persuasion, never absolute certainty, that a given event has precisely such or such an effect. But this result falls far short of Hume's conclusion, 3. That there is no necessary connection between events. Granted that I do not know what, precisely, will be the effect of a given event, I may yet know that it had some cause, and that it will have some effect. I may know, in other words, that every cause has an effect, and that every effect has a cause. This is the same as saying that my inability to know with certainty the precise nature of cause and effect prevents neither the necessary existence of cause or effect, nor my certainty of that necessary relation. A second argument which Hume employs to refute the alleged necessity of the causal relation is the following. Every event, he says, is a fact utterly distinct and therefore separable from every other. Evidently there is no necessary connection between events thus inherently separable. In his own words, all distinct ideas are separable from each other, and as the ideas of cause and effect are evidently distinct, 'twill be easy for us to conceive any object to be non-existent this moment, and existent the next, without conjoining to it the distinct idea of a cause or productive principle. The mind, he says elsewhere, can never possibly find the effect in the supposed cause, by the most accurate scrutiny, for the effect is totally different from the cause, and consequently can never be discovered in it. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first, nor is there anything in the one to suggest the smallest hint of the other. In a word, every effect is a distinct event from its cause. It could not, therefore, be discovered in the cause. This argument is peculiarly important, for, if it holds, it annihilates not merely the causal necessity of inevitable effects, but the temporal necessity as well, the necessity, in other words, of the connection between past and present and future. Present is distinct from past or future in the way in which cause is distinct from effect, and if this distinctness is incompatible with necessary connection, then there is neither temporal nor causal necessary connection. But in this conclusion Hume is utterly and obviously in the wrong. It is true that one event, the cause, is distinguishable from another, the effect, but to be distinguishable, by attention, is different from being separable. And it is a matter of immediate observation that no effect is separable from its cause, and that to be an event means precisely to be a temporal reality with a past and a future. Granted that one thinks of an event at all, one must think of it as having some antecedent and some consequent. One is not certain that this past or this future is of this or that especial nature, but one is quite certain that every event has necessarily some past and some future. Thus, we know the necessity of the temporal relation, just as we know the necessity of mathematical relations, because the contrary is inconceivable. In other words, at least the temporal connection, and for all that has so far appeared, the causal relation, really are what Hume calls relations of ideas, and are therefore necessary. Hume, indeed, tacitly admits the failure of this argument, for he makes constant use of the assumption that past and present are connected with each other. He teaches, as has appeared, that the idea is an effect or copy of the antecedent impression, and that cause and effect are themselves customarily conjoined. Such relations would be impossible if Hume were justified in the teaching that distinguishable perceptions are separable. But Hume has still a third argument directed, like the first, against the purely causal principle. No other than the actual effect could possibly have occurred. He argues that even if the present effect were necessarily connected with the past cause, it would not follow that this cause, if repeated, should, in turn, be followed by the same old effect. For past experience, he says, can be allowed to give direct and certain information of those precise objects only, and that precise period of time, which fell under its cognizance, but why this experience should be extended to future times, and to other objects, this is the main question. It is impossible that any arguments from experience can prove this resemblance of the past to the future. Of course, Hume does not dream of denying the practical probability that recurring causes should be followed by exactly repeated effects. Indeed, he himself searches for a cause of the tendency to passes from cause to effect, after showing that we have no reason for assigning a necessary cause to anything, and he perfectly realizes that all scientific theories and all practical reasonings about conduct are founded on the expectation of the uniform connection of effect with cause. He denies not the practical certainty but the philosophical necessity of the relation. We cannot, he teaches, know absolutely that the event which, in the past, had one effect will, in the future, have a precisely similar effect. For such an assertion is based solely on our experience of the past, and the past is no positive guarantee of the future. By this argument Hume attempts to disprove causal necessity by disproving the absolute uniformity of it. He rightly assumes that if event B inevitably followed on event A, then, supposing that event A should recur, event B would necessarily recur also. He then denies the necessity of this uniformity, that is, the necessity of the recurrence of B, maintaining that if A should recur, it yet might conceivably be followed by an event other than B. He concludes that therefore B did not in the first place necessarily, that is, inevitably, follow upon A. It is obvious that this is a valid inference from Hume's premises. But upholders of causal necessity, though not all of them believe that events can recur, assert, in opposition to Hume, that if event A should recur, then event B would inevitably follow. In the opinion of the writer of this book, Hume is, nonetheless, justified in this teaching that today's event, though the same as yesterday's, does not necessarily have an event the same as yesterday's as its consequent. And this would prove indirectly that some event other than B might originally have followed on A. The results of this discussion may be restated in a slightly different order. If this exposition is accurate and this criticism well-founded, it has been shown, first, that Hume unsuccessfully assails the necessity of that connection between past and present and future, which is involved in the very conception of time. Second, that Hume offers an unsuccessful argument against necessary causal connection, when he urges that we are unable to predict the exact nature of effects. But, finally, that Hume is right in his teaching. It is impossible to argue from particular experiences to universal laws, and it is, so far as has yet appeared, unjustifiable to assert that a recurring cause must uniformly be followed by the same effect. 2. The reduction of causal power to a determination of the mind. The popular conception of causality not only regards it as a necessary connection of cause and effect, but explains necessity as the power of the cause over the effect, a force exerted upon the effect. Hume denies in toto the existence of power in external causes, but he also identifies power with necessity, and attributes power, not at all, as will appear, in the usual sense of the term power, but with a widely altered meaning, to the mind. A. The denial of the alleged power in external objects. If we really were conscious, Hume argues, as we claim to be, of the power of an object over another, we should have an impression of this power, for all our ideas are nothing but copies of our impressions, or, in other words, it is impossible for us to think of anything which we have not antecedently felt, either by our external or internal senses. But when we look about us towards external objects, we are never able, in a single instance, to discover any power. We only find that the one does actually, in fact, follow the other. The impulse of one billiard ball, for example, is attended with motion in the second. To disprove the validity of our idea of the power of an external cause, Hume therefore simply denies the possibility of directly observing any such power. Select, he says in effect, any instance you please of external power, and a careful analysis of your experience will convince you that you observe, see, have an impression of, only the sequence of the effect on the cause. You may observe the size and shape and direction and color of the cause, but you will never observe any distinct attribute which you may call its power. In this teaching Hume is unquestionably right. We observe, not power, but merely the sequence of external events on each other. We suppose ourselves to be directly conscious of the power of one object over another. We say that we see that acid has the power to discolor cloth, or that a lighted match has the power to ignite gunpowder. But as a matter of fact, we do not see the power of the match at all. We see that one event, the lighting of the match, is followed by another, the explosion of the powder, but we do not perceive any quality in the gunpowder, any characteristic beyond its blackness, powdery texture, and the fike, which we can call its power. Hume is perfectly justified in this contention that we are not immediately conscious of the power of objects, and since the usual ground for asserting the existence of this power consists in the supposition that we see and feel it, Hume so far proves his point. There remains, it is true, the possibility that though we do not directly perceive the power of external objects, we nonetheless are justified in inferring or reasoning that it exists. This difficulty is implicitly recognized in an argument already introduced by Hume in a slightly different connection. We get the notion of causality, he has argued, solely by observing the regular and repeated sequence of events. 'Tis not, he says, from any one instance, that we arrive at the idea of cause and effect, of a necessary connection of power. Did we never see any but particular conjunctions of objects, entirely different from each other, we should never be able to form any such ideas. But, 'tis certain, he proceeds, that this repetition of similar objects in similar situations produces nothing new either in these objects, or in any external body. For 'twill readily be allowed that the several instances we have of the conjunction of resembling causes and effects are in themselves entirely independent. Hume's reasoning may then be recapitulated as follows. We cannot infer that power exists in an external cause, for 1. A cause is merely a repeated event, and 2. An event on its first occurrence has no power, for it has been shown that no power is directly observable in it, and 3. The mere repetition of an event adds nothing to its qualities. In the opinion of the writer, this denial that causality is a relation independent of the mind is the most important and the most irrefragable of Hume's negative conclusions. Some of the premises by which he reaches it are, it is true, of questionable cogency. In particular, it might still seem possible, if one questioned Hume's doctrine of impressions, that an external event might possess a power not directly observed. But Hume might have made his point by insisting simply that the causal relation is an object of consciousness, and that it cannot, as such, belong to an alleged world of reality existing independently of consciousness. Whatever the force of his arguments, Hume does not waver in his declaration that necessity is something that exists in the mind, not in objects. Either, he adds, we have no idea of necessity, or necessity is nothing but a determination of the thought. To the consideration of this positive conception of causality as a determination of the thought we must now turn. b. The conception of power as a determination of the mind. Granting that there is no discoverable power in an external object, it may be that, as Leibniz and Berkeley teach, we do know a power of the mind. This is, in some sense, Hume's view, for he distinctly says, though the several resembling instances which give rise to the idea of power can never produce any new quality in the object which can be the model of that idea, yet the observation of this resemblance produces a new impression in the mind, for after we have observed the resemblance in a sufficient number of instances, we immediately feel a determination of the mind to pass from one object to its usual attendant. This determination is the only effect of the resemblance, and therefore must be the same with power or efficacy. Hume's conception of this power which he attributes to mind differs utterly, as must next be observed, from the traditional view of power. For Hume denies both the alleged power of mind over body and the alleged power of the mind to create ideas. These negative teachings must be separately considered. 1. The common belief that mind exerts a power over body is based, Hume declares, on an inaccurate account of our introspection. It is said that we are every moment conscious of internal power, while we feel that by the simple command of our will we can move the organs of our body. But Hume answers that we are directly conscious simply of the sequence of bodily motion on conscious volition. The motion of our body follows upon the command of our will. Of this we are every moment conscious. But of any power or energy in the volition, he adds, we are far from being immediately conscious. He supports this counter-appeal to experience by a more questionable argument. If we were conscious, he urges, of the mind's power over body, we ought to be able to explain it, and, as a matter of fact, we cannot explain it. There is, indeed, no principle in nature more mysterious than the union of soul with body. This argument is inconclusive, for the inability to explain how mental power acts cannot be accepted as a disproof of the mere fact that it does act. But the ineffectiveness of the argument does not, in the view of the writer of this book, prejudice Hume's conclusion. For observation here sustains Hume's initial assertion that I simply am not conscious of a power in my mind which affects my body. In other words, Hume is right when he teaches that, in my consciousness of willing a bodily movement, I do not immediately know the mind is exerting power over the body. I am directly conscious of a sequence of bodily change upon volition, and of a determination of my mind to pass from one to the other, but I am not directly conscious of my mind as influencing the object. 2. From the consideration of the alleged power of mind over body, Hume turns to a study of the problem of the power of mind over ideas. This had been ordinarily conceived, as by Berkeley, as the mind's power to create ideas. Again, Hume denies the existence of any such power. We are not conscious, he insists, of creating ideas, we only feel the event, namely, the existence of an idea consequent to a command of the will. Volition, he adds, is surely an act of the mind, with which we are sufficiently acquainted. Reflect upon it. Consider it on all sides. Do you find anything in it, he demands, like this creative power, by which it raises from nothing a new idea, with a kind of fiat? In this appeal to experience lies the strength of Hume's position. He has other inconclusive arguments from the limitation of the power of mind over ideas, and from our inability to explain this power. But in this challenge to be conscious, if we can, of ourselves as creators of ideas, he certainly scores a point against Berkeley, since we are rather the recipients and possessors than the creators of our ideas, even the most novel of them. In spite of Hume's belief that in our use of the expressions power and force as ordinarily applied, we have really no distinct meaning, and make use only of common words without any clear and determinate ideas, he nonetheless insists, as has been shown, that we have an impression of mental power. To make clear this conception of Hume and to estimate it is the main concern of this section. It will be recalled that Hume's argument for the existence of mental power or necessity is, briefly, the following. Repeated instances of a given cause followed by its effect do produce the impression of power, but the repetition can neither discover nor produce anything new in an external object, therefore the power of which we have the impression must be mental. This reasoning is confirmed by the fact that we immediately feel a determination of the mind to carry our thoughts from one object to another. In this determination of the mind, Hume teaches, power consists. It is evidently then of importance to know exactly what he means by the term determination. We are tempted to think that he uses it as we might use the words will and decision. If this were true, Hume would be rightly interpreted as upholding what, in the view of the writer, is the correct doctrine of will. He would be saying, in effect, though we cannot know that the mind affects bodily movements or that it creates ideas, yet we do know that it is capable of an active and dominating attitude toward external things, and toward its own ideas. But such an interpretation is, for several reasons, impossible. In the first place, Hume is here discussing power as it is manifested in the consciousness of all forms of causal relation, so-called external as well as internal causality, and he could never mean that my will affirms, for example, the sequence of sound on vibration. In the second place, the synonyms used by Hume for the expression determination of the mind show conclusively that he does not refer to the will, however conceived. For in place of the expression determination of the mind, he repeatedly uses the terms transition of the imagination and inference. Thus, in teaching that causality involves mental power and that this power is a determination or transition of the mind, Hume means simply the following. We are unquestionably conscious of what we call cause and effect, for example, of the motion of a ball as cause of the motion in another ball. This consciousness first of moving ball A and then of moving ball B is a transition of the mind, and my consciousness of my mind as moving from one to the other is an impression of power. This is the sum and substance of the mental power involved in causality, as it is expressly defined by Hume. It is evident that such a definition of power does not conform to the ordinary usage of the term, but it is equally evident that a mental transition, under whatever name, is involved in tracing cause and effect. This is the important truth of Hume's teaching, later strongly emphasized and amplified by Kant. The significant defect of the teaching is its failure to distinguish the mental transition in the causal relation from that which is involved in every relation. There may be, for example, as much mental transition in realizing that the uprising in Russia is like the French Revolution, as in recognizing that a bell stroke is the cause of a sound. It follows that though Hume's teaching, that mental transition is involved in causality, is correct, it is also inadequate, for it does not suffice to distinguish causality from other relations. A brief restatement of Hume's doctrine of causality with the more important of our comments on it will conclude this section. Hume teaches negatively that causality does not involve the necessary connection of past with present and of present with future, that causality does not involve the uniform relation of cause and effect, and that causality is not an external relation, that is, a relation existing independently of consciousness. The first of these assertions Hume cannot make good, the second and third, in the opinion of the writer, are sound doctrine, though Hume's argument is at certain points defective. Positively, Hume teaches that causality is a customary conjunction of events, namely, the mental habit of inferring one event from another. This positive teaching is significant and is true as far as it goes, but it is inadequate in that Hume fails to distinguish causal inference from other forms of mental transition. The doctrine is well summarized in the following passage. We say that the vibration of this string is the cause of this particular sound. But what do we mean by that affirmation? We mean that this vibration is followed by this sound, and that all similar vibrations have been followed by similar sounds. That is, that this vibration is followed by the sound, and that upon the appearance of the one, the mind forms immediately an idea of the other. 2. Hume's doctrine of external objects, independent of the mind. A. The teaching that external objects cannot be known by the senses. This discussion of Hume's basal theories, the impression test of knowledge and the conception of causality as a mental connection of experienced facts, is an essential prerequisite to the study of his theory of reality. For by these standards Hume measures all metaphysical conceptions. He admits the existence of those realities, and of those only, which meet his impression test of knowledge, and which do not seem to him to invalidate his conception of causality. Through these tests, then, he proceeds to gauge the reality of bodies, or external objects, and of souls, or selves. With the first of these topics this section is concerned. By body Hume understands what we have expressed by the awkward term non-ideal reality, a reality which is, in the first place, independent of our perceptions, and, in the second place, entirely different from them. To describe this non-ideal reality, Hume uses the expressions, matter-body or bodies external objects and objects. The character of these objects on which Hume lays most stress is their independence of our perceptions. An external universe, he says, depends not on our perceptions, but would exist though we and every sensible creature were absent or annihilated. Hume's arguments to disprove the existence of such an external universe closely resemble, as he does not fail to indicate, those of Berkeley. He argues, first, that external objects cannot be known by the senses, that they are not, in Berkeley's term, perceived directly. In favor of this conclusion, he urges, first, that our senses are known and admitted to be fallacious. Of this imperfection and fallaciousness of our organs, we have, he says, numberless instances. The crooked appearance of an oar in water, the various aspects of objects according to their different distances, the double images which arise from the pressing one eye. This fact, that some of the objects which seem to us external are mere illusions, makes it impossible to trust to our direct sense consciousness of externality. Nor may we, after Descartes' fashion, have recourse to the veracity of the Supreme Being, in order to prove the veracity of our senses. This, Hume rightly observes, is making a very unexpected circuit. If his veracity, he continues, were at all concerned in this matter, our senses would be entirely infallible, because it is not possible that he can ever deceive. In other words, Descartes' argument proves too much. Our senses certainly do sometimes deceive us, and it follows either that the veracity of the Supreme Being is no guarantee against such deception, or else that there is no veracious Supreme Being. Besides arguing from the experience fallaciousness of our senses that we have no sense knowledge of objects independent of mind, Hume reaches the same conclusion by considering the nature of the alleged external object of the senses. Such an object, he observes, is believed to be made up of primary and of secondary qualities. But, as he points out, it is universally allowed by modern inquirers that all the sensible qualities of objects such as hard, soft, hot, cold, white, black, etc., are merely secondary, and exist not in the objects themselves, but are perceptions of the mind, without any external model, which they represent. If this be allowed, with regard to secondary qualities, it must also follow, with regard to the supposed primary qualities of extension and solidity. Finally, Hume, like Berkeley, appeals to our introspection to assure us that we really are not directly conscious of things outside us, but that are immediately certain consciousnesses of our own experience. Nothing, he says, can ever be present to the mind but an image or perception, and no man, who reflects, ever doubted that the existences, which we consider, when we say this house and that tree are nothing but perceptions, in the mind, b. The teaching that objects external to the mind cannot be known by reason. In addition to the everyday conviction that objects external to the mind are known to sense or directly perceived, Hume recognizes the philosophical hypothesis that we must infer the existence of objects distinct from our directly known perceptions. The doctrine is familiar to us through Berkeley's arguments against it. Admitting that the colored, extended things which we directly know are merely our own percepts or thoughts, it teaches that they are nonetheless exist real things, very probably unlike these percepts, and in any case independent of them and distinct from them, and that we know the existence of these things by reason or inference. Hume argues, as Berkeley has argued, that we have no right to make this inference, no basis for the conclusion that these external objects exist. His argument is worthy of attention. Those philosophers, he points out, who teach that external objects, realities independent of consciousness, must be inferred to exist, base this inference on the fact that our impressions, or perceptions of things, require a cause, and argue that real, distinct existences must cause these sense impressions. But Hume believes that he has shown that causality is not a power inherent in an external object, that it is, on the contrary, an experience connection between successive facts, a connection known by the mind. Now, if causality be mental, the facts connected by causality must be mental facts. In other words, the causal relation, being through and through mental, cannot extend beyond the mind. This argument is clearly implied in the following paragraph. The only conclusion we can draw from the existence of one thing to that of another is by means of the relation of cause and effect, which shows that there is a connection betwixt them, and that the existence of one is dependent on that of the other. But as no beings are ever present to the mind but perceptions, it follows that we may observe a conjunction or a relation of cause and effect between different perceptions, but can never observe it between perceptions and objects. 'Tis impossible, therefore, that from the existence of the former, we can ever form any conclusion concerning the existence of the latter. There is no escape from this argument, if Hume's conception of causality as a mental relation be admitted. If causality is a purely mental connection, it surely cannot be a bridge between the mental and the non-mental. The only reason to question Hume's use of the argument is the doubt of his having proved satisfactorily this purely mental nature of causality. The position taken in this chapter is that he might fully have proved the point, but has actually left certain parts of his argument unguarded. It must be noticed, however, that Hume implies, in the passage quoted, a more fundamental argument against the existence of material reality, as inferred to exist, an argument which does not depend on the validity of his conception of causality. Objects inferred to exist are, he says, nonetheless objects of consciousness, objects present on the mind. But nothing which is present to the mind can possess an existence independent of mind. It is then a contradiction in terms to teach that the mind must infer, whatever be the principle of inference, the existence of external objects, for it is the nature of such objects to be independent of consciousness. By the use of this reasoning, Hume advances a far stronger argument than Berkeley's in opposition to the doctrine that matter, reality independent of mind, must be inferred as cause of perceptions. Berkeley has urged, in objection to this view, that matter is by common consent passive or inert, so that it may not be conceived as cause of anything, still less as cause of active spirit. This objection, it was pointed out, is ineffective against the dynamic conception of matter as energy or force. Hume's argument does not encounter this difficulty, for he argues against the inferred existence of material reality, not on the disputed ground of the passivity of matter, but on the ground of its basal character, namely, its existence independent of consciousness. Hume's position, therefore, is one of great strength. It is, indeed, in the opinion of the writer, unassailable. Descartes and the other dualists who taught that matter, namely, reality independent of consciousness, must exist as cause of our perceptions. In reply to this, Hume asserts, first, that causality is a relation within consciousness, and consequently cannot assure us of the reality of anything outside consciousness, and second, that, whatever the basis of the inference, inferred objects must be known objects, objects present to the mind, and cannot therefore be possessed of independent existence. Hume has thus followed Berkeley in despoiling the universe of material reality, reality independent of mind. He teaches that we neither perceive nor justly infer the existence of external objects. In their place we have simply perceptions which are present to the mind. C. The inconsistent assumption that external objects exist. It is not possible to turn from the contemplation of Hume's disproof of the existence of material reality, without taking account of the extraordinary inconsistency with which he nonetheless implies in every part of his works the existence of these objects independent of mind. This discovery of inconsistencies in Hume's teaching is not surprising. Already it has been shown that he is untrue to his impression test of knowledge, since he admits the occurrence of relations, and that, while denying necessity in the scientific experience, he affirms it in the case of so-called voluntary actions. Nowhere, however, is Hume's inconsistency more marked in itself and more insidious in its consequences than at just this point. There can be, as has appeared, no remotest doubt that he denies the possibility of either perceiving or inferring the existence of objects other than perceptions. Yet the discovery of this idealistic doctrine comes as a revelation to one who reads Hume for the first time. For throughout treatise and inquiry alike, Hume has persistently implied the real and independent existence of objects. These implications are especially frequent in the exposition of his two basal doctrines. The impression test of knowledge and the theory of causality. For example, he opposes causality to the mathematical relations on the ground that causality has to do with matters of fact or objects, whereas the mathematical principles are relations of ideas. But the distinction evidently has no force if, as Hume believes, the objects are themselves perceptions present to the mind. Again he teaches, as will be remembered, that impressions are distinguished from the corresponding ideas mainly on the ground that these impressions are occasioned by the stimulation of the sense organs through external objects. The distinction certainly loses its intended significance if sense organs and external objects alike are themselves perceptions of the mind. I say, for example, that my impression of red differs from my idea of red, because a red object stimulated my retina when I received the impression, and was absent when I had the idea. The implication is this. Because a real object occasioned the impression, therefore the impression differs from the idea and indeed becomes a criterion of reality. But if, as Hume teaches, the real red object is itself a perception, it cannot endow the impression with any reality superior to that of the idea. Hume, nonetheless, wins the assent of many readers to the impression test of knowledge, because his language lends itself to the everyday theory that impressions have a superior certainty, due to their dependence on supposedly real material objects, sense organs and the physical things which stimulate them. In many other passages, more or less significant in relation to his argument, Hume implies or asserts that independent existence of matter which he ends by discrediting. It is universally allowed, he says, when teaching that voluntary actions are necessary, that matter, in all its operations, is actuated by a necessary force. This sentence is surely misleading as used by a writer who a little later argues that the opinion of external existence is contrary to reason. Contradictory statements or implications of this sort are found cheek by jowl within a single paragraph or even sentence. The paragraph, for example, quoted above, in which Hume asserts that nothing can ever be present to the mind, but an image or perception, defines perceptions as copies or representations of other existences, which remain uniform and independent. But precisely this independent existence is what Hume later insists that we neither perceive nor rightly infer. Of course, these inconsistencies in no wise invalidate the force of Hume's argument, if that is cogent, against the existence of realities independent of the mind, but they idly shake the reader's confidence in Hume's good faith, and lay Hume open to the suspicion of trying to gain, by implication, the benefit of everyday convictions, which, by right of logic, would oppose his doctrines. 3. Hume's doctrine of self. Hume's metaphysical doctrine is, up to this point, a mere reassertion of Berkeley's immaterialism, an idealistic conception of the universe. To Leibniz and to Berkeley, and indeed to all idealists before Hume, this means simply that the universe is a society of interrelated spirits, or persons. Hume's originality consists in his teaching that the universe, though immaterial, is yet not spiritual, that it is made up of mental facts or ideas, perceptions as Hume calls them, with no spirits or selves to which the perceptions belong. A certain complex, or group, or series, of these ideas may, indeed, on this principle be called a mind or self, but this self has no identity or permanence or character of its own. It is a mere heap of distinct ideas, each of which exists for itself. Hume's reasons for denying the existence of selves, as distinct from these mere bundles of perceptions, are somewhat arbitrarily divided into arguments against the existence of any spiritual substance and arguments against the existence of any self. The division may be disregarded, for spiritual substance really means nothing if not self. Hume's arguments against the existence of a self. By self is meant, Hume rightly supposes, that which is conscious, which is fundamental to its ideas, its perceptions, as Hume calls them, which is relatively permanent, or better, identical, in the flux of ideas. Hume argues against the existence of a self, so conceived, first on the ground that ideas, perceptions, exist independently, and that there is, thus, no need of a self in which the ideas may inhere. Second, on the ground that I am not conscious of myself, whereas if there were an I must be conscious of it. These considerations must be discussed in order. The most important argument, Hume believes, brought forward to prove the existence of a self, is the following. Since ideas exist, there exists also a somewhat more permanent than they in which they inhere or to which they belong. Now Hume denies this premise. Our perceptions, he says, have no need of anything in which to inhere, because each is independent, each exists for itself, inherits in itself as it were, in fact, fulfills for itself the alleged requirement of a substance. All our perceptions, he says, are different from each other, and from everything else in the universe. They are also distinct and separable, and may be considered as separately existent, and may exist separately, and have no need of anything else to support their existence. But this argument, if it is valid, proves only this: that from the existence of ideas it is not necessary to infer the existence of any self. In other words, it proves at most that a self does not necessarily exist, and is far from proving that a self does not exist. Hume's second argument is farther reaching. If, he teaches, there is an I fundamental to my perceptions, then it is self-conscious. In other words, I must be conscious of myself if such a self exist. But, he proceeds, I am not conscious of myself, therefore no self exists. In two ways Hume seeks to make good the assertion that I am not conscious of myself. 1. He reiterates, in the first place, the statement that one never has an impression of a self. In part 1 of the treatise, this teaching occurs in its most general form, the assertion that one never has an impression of substance. I would fain ask, philosophers, he says, whether the idea of substance be derived from the impressions of sensation or of reflection. If it be conveyed to us by our senses, I ask, which of them, and after what manner? If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be a color; if by the ears, a sound; if by the palate, a taste. And so of the other senses. But I believe none will assert that substance is either a color, or sound, or a taste. The idea of substance must therefore be derived from an impression of reflection, if it really exist. But the impressions of reflection resolve themselves into our passions and emotions, none of which can possibly represent a substance. We have therefore no idea of substance, distinct from that of a collection of particular qualities. In part 4 of the treatise, Hume urges the same argument with reference no longer to the existence of substance in general, but to that of the spiritual substance, or self. It is impossible, he holds, that a self should exist, for there never can occur an impression of a self, because impressions are, one and all, fleeting and evanescent, perishing with the instant which gives them birth, whereas a self is supposed to be identical through succeeding moments. It must be some one impression that gives rise to every real idea. But self or person is not any one impression, but that to which your several impressions and ideas are supposed to have a reference. If any impression gives rise to the idea of self, that impression must continue invariably the same, through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression constant and invariable. Pain and pleasure, grief and joy, passions and sensations, succeed each other, and never all exist at the same time. It cannot, therefore, be from any of these impressions, or from any other, that the idea of self is derived, and consequently there is no such idea. The argument just outlined presupposes the validity of Hume's impression test of knowledge, and would fall far short of convincing anyone who denied this doctrine of impressions. For the benefit of such a reader, Hume reinforces his position by a direct appeal to introspection. He begins by a clear and forcible statement of his opponent's teaching. There are, he says, some philosophers who imagine we are every moment intimately conscious of what we call ourself, that we feel its existence and its continuance in existence, the strongest sensation, the most violent passion, say they, instead of distracting us from this view, only fix it the more intensely, and make us consider their influence on self. To attempt a farther proof of this were to weaken its evidence, since no proof can be derived from any fact of which we are so intimately conscious, nor is there anything of which we can be certain, if we doubt of this. This assertion of our consciousness of self Hume flatly denies. Unluckily, he continues, all these positive assertions are contrary to that very experience which is pleaded for them, nor have we any idea of self, after the manner it is here explained. In supposed self-consciousness, on the contrary, one is really only conscious of a particular collection of impressions and ideas. For my part, he asserts, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other, of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception. When my perceptions are removed for any time, as by sound sleep, so long am I insensible of myself and may be truly said not to exist. And were all my perceptions removed by death, and could I neither think, nor feel, nor see, nor love, nor hate after the dissolution of my body, I should be entirely annihilated. If anyone, upon serious and unprejudiced reflection, thinks he has a different notion of himself, I must confess I can reason no longer with him. We are essentially different in this particular. He may, perhaps, perceive something simple and continued, which he calls himself, though I am certain there is no such principle in me. Hume concludes, accordingly, that setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, he may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind, that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in a perpetual flux and movement. What we call a mind, he says in another passage, is nothing but a heap or collection of different perceptions, united together by certain relations, and supposed, though falsely, to be endowed with a perfect simplicity and identity. It is necessary now to estimate with utmost care each of these arguments against the existence of a self. According to the first of them, a self need not be inferred as substratum of ideas, since an idea is self-sufficient, independent, separate from all other reality. But this assertion of self-dependence, the isolation of ideas, flatly contradicts the teaching of psychology. It is a commonplace of psychologists, from Plato to St. Augustine, and from Hobbes to Wundt, that ideas are associated and interrelated. There is little need to argue this point, for Hume himself makes the admission, damaging as it is to his system. In the significant appendix which he added to Volume 3 of the original edition of the treatise there occur these memorable paragraphs. All perceptions are distinct. They are, therefore, distinguishable and separable, and may exist separately, but having thus loosened all our particular perceptions, when I proceed to explain the principle of connection, which binds them together, and makes us attribute to them a real simplicity and identity, I am sensible that my account is very defective. In short, there are two principles, which I cannot render consistent, nor is it in my power to renounce either of them, viz. That all our distinct perceptions are distinct existences, and that the mind never perceives any real connection among distinct existences. Did our perceptions either inhere in something simple and individual, or did the mind perceive some real connection among them, there would be no difficulty in the case. It is evident from these paragraphs that Hume himself admits a principle of connection binding perceptions together, and he certainly, therefore, is not entitled to argue, from the independence of perceptions, that we must not infer a self to exist. But the more significant of Hume's arguments remains for consideration. The presupposition of the second argument is unassailable. Certainly, as Hume throughout assumes, if a self exists, then I am conscious of it, for self means self-conscious being. But now, according to Hume, I am as a fact not conscious of a self, therefore no self exists. Hume's denial of self-consciousness is, thus, the significant part of his argument. As has appeared, he makes the denial on two grounds. 1. He urges that I have no impression of myself, and that without impression there is no knowledge. Against this argument it may be claimed, in the first place, that Hume is not justified in denying impressions of myself. To be sure, I have no sense impressions of myself, in other words, I do not see or feel or hear myself, yet I may be said to have an emotional consciousness of myself, and emotions, it will be remembered, are included in Hume's class of impressions of reflection. To this an advocate of Hume might answer, Hume's special point is that a self is supposed to have permanence, and that there can be no impression of permanence. But precisely this last assertion is incorrect. Hume could not make it save for the inadequacy, already pointed out, in his impression theory of consciousness. Either we are not even conscious of permanence at all, do not know what is meant by the word, but not even Hume asserts this, or we have an idea of it without having an impression of it, which is quite contrary to Hume's teaching, or we do have an impression of it. Whichever statement of the case be true, Hume is clearly wrong when he teaches that to know one must have an impression, that to know the self one must know it is permanent, that one has no impression of permanence, and, therefore, finally, that one does not know any self. We have so far discredited Hume's attempt to prove from the independence of perceptions that it is needless to infer a self as the substratum in which they inhere. We have seen, furthermore, the weakness of Hume's first reason for denying the direct consciousness of self. There remains his denial of self-consciousness through the mere appeal to introspection. And with this we have reached the crucial point of the discussion. The failure of the preceding reasoning is unimportant if now Hume can convince me that I am, after all, not directly conscious of a self, that I am, in fact, conscious only of perceptions, impressions and ideas. Descartes had reasoned. I exist, for to doubt or to deny my existence requires a doubting or denying I. Hume answers. Doubt or denial requires not an I, but an idea, not a doubter, but a doubt, and, as a matter of experience, I am conscious not of the self or doubter, but of the idea, the doubt. The first comment to be made upon this teaching is this, that it does not follow from the premise. As has appeared, Hume reaches the conclusion from the observation that he is never conscious of himself except as perceiving. But I may readily grant that I am never conscious of myself, except as conscious in some particular way, that is, as having a perception of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hate, pain or pleasure, without thereby denying that I am at the same time conscious of a self which perceives. In other words, it is certainly true that a self without perceptions is never experienced, but it does not follow that there is no self. On the other hand, it well may be that the perceptions are those of a self. b. The inconsistent assumption that a self exists. In favor of this view that in being conscious of perceptions one is also conscious of a self, it should now be observed that Hume, spite of his denial of a self, constantly presupposes its existence. On every page of treatise. End of inquiry. Alike, he alludes to mind or myself as more than a mere bundle of perceptions, and attributes to it characters, in particular, activity and consciousness, which cannot possibly belong to mere perceptions. Thus, he speaks of the operations of the mind. He says, in another place, that imagination has the command over all its ideas. And he teaches, even more explicitly, that the mind has the command over all its ideas, and can separate, unite, mix, and vary them, as it pleases. Hume's assertions of the relative permanence, or continuity, of the mind are equally unambiguous. The mind, naturally continues, he says. The imagination, he has observed just previously, when set into any train of thinking, is apt to continue, even when its object fails it, and like a galley put in motion by the oars, carries on its course without any new impulse. But a mere bundle of evanescent perceptions could neither separate, unite, and mix ideas, nor yet continue in a train of thinking. This inconsistency is made especially evident by the effort to replace Hume's personal pronouns, in his very argument against the self, by some form of his exact definition of self. The passage quoted on page 182 would read, thus translated, when a bundle of perceptions enters most intimately into what it calls this bundle of perceptions, it always stumbles on some particular perception or other of heat or cold. Thus expressed, without inconsistency with Hume's doctrine, the passage loses all that persuasiveness which it actually possesses, because of its virtual implication of that self which it ostensibly denies. These implications, it must be observed, of the existence of minds or selves, underlying the succession of ideas, are not mere unessential lapses from Hume's central teaching. On the contrary, this conception of a self is fundamental to no fewer than 4 of Hume's explicit doctrines or arguments. The first of these is his conception of causality. It has already been shown that he defines causality as transition and inference of the mind. But the occurrence of a transition implies the existence of a permanent being, within which the transition occurs. Fleeting perceptions can replace or succeed each other, but there can be no transition in them. A second teaching of Hume, which is based on the assumption of the very self which he denies, is his doctrine of personal identity, that is, his method of accounting for what he terms the false supposition of personal identity. For, though Hume argues against the fact of personal identity, he nonetheless has to admit our great propension to suppose ourselves possessors of it. He goes on to explain the alleged consciousness of personal identity as the easy transition of the mind from one object to another, the smooth and uninterrupted progress of the thought along a train of connected ideas. But this transition of the mind involves, as has just appeared, a continuous mind, a self distinct from series of resembling unconnected ideas. So, Hume actually opposes what he calls the false conception of personal identity, by an explanation which assumes the existence of what is virtually the same, a continuous self. The remaining doctrines which require the assumption of a self fundamental to ideas, belong to Hume's psychological and ethical teaching, not to the metaphysical system which, in this chapter, is mainly considered. One important form of his doctrine of the passions, that is to say, his psychology of the emotions, is based upon the doctrine of a self in social relation with other selves. Not the impression or idea, but the self, is, Hume teaches, the unit of the affective consciousness. Thus, pride is defined as a certain satisfaction in ourselves. Love or friendship is said to be a complacency in another. Self is described as ever intimately present to us. In his moral philosophy, finally, Hume assumes explicitly the existence of selves in social relations. Good and bad resolve themselves, for him, into useful and harmful or pleasant and painful. But pleasure and pain arise, he teaches, through sympathy with others as well as through personal experience. The utility which is object of virtue is that of society no less than that of the individual. Indeed, the very notion of morals implies, Hume says, some sentiment common to all mankind, the sentiment of humanity. But sympathy and society and humanity imply inevitably actual selves, distinct though inseparable from their ideas, and in vital relation with each other. After the outline and the estimate of Hume's doctrine of the self, it is necessary at the end to review the bearing of the doctrine on the question fundamental to all philosophy. Is there a self which underlies evanescent psychic phenomena? Hume's arguments to prove the self non-existent are fundamentally two. He argues that a self need not exist, on the ground that our perceptions, independently existing, have no need of a subject in which to inhere, but he fails to prove even to his own satisfaction that perceptions do exist independently. Then he argues that a self does not exist, on the ground that our alleged self-consciousness is, after all, a mere consciousness of perceptions, but his very argument refutes itself and implies the truth that a consciousness of different perceptions is also, inevitably, a consciousness of a perceiving self. It is thus evident that Hume's arguments are incapable of disproving the existence of a self, and it is fair to add that no essentially new arguments have been advanced since the treatise was published. The case for the self is immeasurably strengthened, also, by the discovery that Hume's own philosophy, from start to finish, implies the existence of a self. Against the force of these considerations, it may, however, be objected that Hume's inconsistency is not ipso facto an argument for the existence of a self, and that the disproof of Hume's arguments leaves undisturbed the proofs which future philosophers may conceivably bring forward. This abstract possibility is not to be denied, but, in the view of the writer, does not affect one's conviction of an existing self, a unique and identical reality which underlies and unifies distinct perceptions. For this conviction is not, primarily, an argued conclusion, it is a direct and therefore an unproved certainty contained in every conscious experience. Of course, this initially immediate assurance is later reflected on, and it is immensely strengthened by the study of Hume and the other philosophers who refuse to recognize a self. For such a study shows that the arguments are invalid which are urged against the existence of a self, and that the existence of a self is constantly assumed by those who deny it. In the last resort, however, I can only assert, without proving, my direct consciousness of my own existence. 4. Hume's teaching about God. It has already appeared that Hume argues against the existence of objects independent of the mind, and yet that he tacitly assumes that ideas correspond to external objects, that he has said there is no self, and yet that his doctrines of causality and identity, to name no others, imply the existence of a self. It will not be surprising, therefore, to discover that Hume everywhere assumes the existence of a supreme being or deity, although it is evident that on Hume's principles, we have no right to believe that there is a God. It is true that Hume never argues definitely against the existence of God, for even the skeptic Philo, in the dialogues concerning natural religion, never questions the being, but only the nature of the deity. But Hume's arguments to disprove the existence of substance, material or spiritual, apply as well to God as to finite realities. In the first place, if God is conceived as a causal being, totally distinct from human experience, then the argument by which Hume proves that we may not infer the existence of external objects tells equally against the existence of God. For causality is a relation within experience, and God cannot, therefore, be conceived as infinite cause, and at the same time as existing independently of experience. If, on the other hand, God be conceived as infinite spirit, or greater self, then Hume's arguments against the existence of selves would also tell, if they were valid arguments, against God's existence. We have questioned their cogency, but Hume employed them, and it follows that there is no place in his philosophy for God. In the eyes of the uncritical reader, Hume's conclusions gain plausibility by his unjustified appropriation of the God, the external objects, and the finite selves whom he has elaborately annihilated. In the mind of the rigidly logical thinker, on the other hand, this procedure awakens a suspicion, not indeed of Hume's personal sincerity, but of his intellectual honesty, and of the value of his teaching. No one, however, can deny the significance of two portions of Hume's doctrine: his conception of causality, and his denial of the existence of a self. Important features of his causal doctrine had, indeed, been suggested by Berkeley, but Hume first elaborated and fused the significant teachings that causality is not an immaterial power, that it is rather a sequence of events or, more clearly scrutinized, a mental continuity or transition. These elements of his doctrine have become inward in the fiber of modern philosophical thinking. His equally emphasized denial of the necessity of the causal sequence is, on the other hand, chiefly important because it initiated Kant's defense of causal necessity. Even more significant among philosophical doctrines is Hume's reduction of all selves to mere bundles of fleeting and unconnected ideas, and his consequent conception of the universe as nothing more than a mass of loosely connected perceptions, momentary sensations, for example, of red, sweet, soft, and fragrant, and equally fleeting emotions of love and hate and avarice and the like. The importance of this conception is not due to its validity. On the contrary, as it has been the effort of this chapter to show, the doctrine is argued from invalid premises and contradicts our most immediate certainty. Yet Hume has rendered a service to philosophy in setting forth this theory, erroneous as it is. An error never can be refuted till it has been clearly stated, and an unformulated and unrefuted error may work incalculable injury from the shadowy recesses of the mind which vaguely holds it. Now Hume's annihilation of the self is obviously a doctrine of vital consequences. If the supposed self is a mere parcel of perceptions, replaced a moment hence by another kaleidoscopic complex of sensations, plainly there is no ground for belief in personal immortality, no philosophic basis for a conviction of personal responsibility. Precisely because of its practical significance, therefore, Hume's denial of the self tends to incite his readers to a closer analysis of the conception of a self, a more careful study of the relations of selves. This effect of Hume's doctrine the succeeding chapters will consider.